morning. Welcome to the Kazakhstan American Corners program. My name is Timur and I'm the coordinator at American Corner Pavlodar, and I'll be hosting today's meeting. Let me briefly tell you about the American Corners. So we are friendly and welcoming American-style information and resource centers. We are open to the public and completely free of charge. Hosted in libraries all over Kazakhstan, we provide access to high-quality English language resources, English conversation clubs, information about education in the United States, also STEM programs, and a large research database, American books, movies, games, and much, much more. You can easily connect with new friends, practice your English, and learn about the United States. Thank you for joining us today. And today's topic is Holocaust Human Tragedy. Today is a special day. It's a day when we commemorate the victims of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a period in history at the time of World War II, when millions of Jewish people were murdered because of who they were. Here we can learn more about its causes, backgrounds, and the stages of the Holocaust, as well as the perpetrators. Many thanks to our guest speaker from the United States, Leora Eisenberg, who is a young researcher. Her interests include Soviet history, foreign languages, and Central Asia. Leora, I give the floor to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. You'll have to excuse me. It's 9 p.m. here, so my brain isn't as functional as it normally is. It's a pleasure to see so many people interested in Jewish history and in the Holocaust, as this is, I believe, a very important topic. I'll try to speak slowly since I realize that many of you here are using this as an opportunity to practice your English. But if at any point you don't understand me, feel free to write something in the direct messages or tell Timur. I'll be sharing my screen, so I won't be able to see the messages, but just stop me if at any point you don't understand what I have to say. Before I begin, I should tell you that I'm not an expert in the Holocaust. As Timur said, my specialty is actually Soviet history, but I'm Jewish. And as many of you probably know, nearly every Jewish person alive today has some story related to the Holocaust. My mom's side is from St. Petersburg, so they were actually in the siege of Leningrad during World War II, and they don't have much related to the Holocaust. But my grandfather's side of the family was my father's side of the family was very personally affected by the Holocaust, in large part because he's from Poland. Some of you might know that Poland had a very large Jewish population at the time of World War II, approximately 25%. Germany's Jewish population was approximately like 0.75%. It wasn't even 1% of the whole population. So suffice it to say that my grandfather had a difficult childhood. Unfortunately, his father was killed by the Nazis when my grandfather was 7. Most of his family was sent to concentration camps. He spent 1 year in hiding from the Nazis in an attic. He masqueraded as an altar boy in a Catholic church. There was a lot. He spent 6 months in jail when crossing a border illegally, since Jews were not allowed to flee. And the stories go on. And he is just one individual out of 6 million Jews whose lives were taken in the Holocaust. 6 million other individuals were also victims of the Holocaust. These were Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, people from the LGBTQ community, Blacks, people with disabilities, and so on. And so mental and physical were also victims of the Holocaust. And we have to remember that as well. Before I begin, does anyone have any questions for me? I'm going to show you slides, but I really want to encourage you to ask questions. Anything for me before we begin? Okay, I see silence, so that means I'm going to start sharing my slides. Again, any point, just feel free to ask any questions that you may have. I realize that this is new for you and probably isn't covered in as many Kazakhstani schools as I would probably like. So I'm going to begin sharing my screen. Give me a moment. I'm going to open my slides. Go back to Zoom and share. Okay. All right, can everyone see my slides? Timur, you can say yes or no.
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. So I have to be honest, I did not make all of these slides on my own. I edited them. These are from the United States Holocaust Museum. They are an excellent resource, and I really recommend that you check them out. Check out their website if you can. Very, very good. I should warn you that some of the photos in this presentation are graphic. Graphic means disgusting or terrible, hard to see. So I will warn you before I show these photographs, just so that anyone who doesn't like to look at these things can take a second to step away from the computer. With that said, however, I would encourage you to stay at the computer as long as you can, just because this is an important part of our history, of the world's history. Genocide, events like the Holocaust, genocides like the Holocaust apply to each and every one of us. And we should take the time, especially on Holocaust Remembrance Day, to kind of consider their impact on our society. So a lot of us think of the Holocaust as something that's just related to World War II. But in reality, the foundation for the Holocaust was laid far before 1938, the official beginning. It really started in 1935, which is when Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, rose to power and created and spread the ideology that led to the systematic persecution and murder of Europe's Jews. Not just Europe's Jews, of course, it's other groups, as I mentioned, but this is the main group of the Holocaust. This is now called a genocide, known as the Holocaust. Has everyone here heard the term genocide? You can turn your microphone off and on and just tell me quickly if you have or haven't.
Yes.
Haven't.
Have
Yes.
Heard you. Yes.
It's genocide of Armenian. Yes, we have.
Yes, exactly. So the term genocide officially only became known after the Holocaust. As far as I know, I did some research on this. It only became classified as a crime. The first time it was used was maybe in 1944 or 1945 by a scholar named Raphael Lemkin. You don't need to know that. But the United Nations first categorized it as a crime in 1946 and only codified it as a crime against humanity in 1948. A genocide has two components. It is mental and it is physical. The mental component is the desire to kill, to exterminate, annihilate, kill entirely, in part or in whole, a group. It can be racial, it can be ethnic, it can be religious. Jews are an ethnic group as well as a religious group and a cultural group. But this can apply to anything or any group, not just Jews. That's the mental part, this desire to kill a group, to get rid of a group entirely. Then there's the physical part, which is killing, reduction of birth, persecution, reduction of living conditions, and so on and so forth. So the Holocaust, even though there were many genocides before, such as the Armenian genocide, which a participant just brought up, the Holocaust is what kind of ukorenila, kind of rooted the term in common usage today. The Nazi regime, which Hitler was at the head of, persecuted means kind of punished, and killed millions of other people that it considered politically, racially, or socially unfit. One group that I forgot to mention were communists and socialists who were also persecuted, killed, hunted by the Nazi party. If you don't know any words, or you can write them at the chat box and Timur can ask me to define them, and I will do that with great pleasure. So let's begin with the beginning, right? So in 1933, Hitler rises to power and addresses the German parliament, known as the Reichstag, which is a word that I'm sure many of you have encountered. As the chancellor, he gains the power to rule by emergency decree. Emergency decree is, I think in Russian, чрезвычайный указ. I'm not completely sure, but this is when you get the power to kind of make any decision you want, and you can declare any situation an emergency, right? This gives Hitler a tremendous amount of power in Germany at the time. So one of the first things he does, he begins to hunt or persecute people whom he considers a threat to the regime, to the Nazi ideology. So the first people he begins to hunt are communists and socialists, as I mentioned before. And I originally had a picture, but for the sake of brevity, of shortness, I got rid of it. Soon after, he begins to create discriminatory conditions. He begins to discriminate against Jews. And the first way he does this is economic, okay? So Jewish shops, like the one showed in the picture, have to label themselves. So this is from 1933, but this persists until the beginning of the Holocaust. Remember that the Holocaust only officially begins in 1938. So this was called the Jewish store boycott, Jewish shop boycott. It was originally called off after 24 hours. Okay, it was later reinstated. To reinstate means to bring something back, to bring a law back. So this boycott was made into law. It was canceled, and then it was reinstated. It was brought back. It continued really until 1938 when the Holocaust officially began, and continued after that. It's important to note that the Olympics happened, I think they were in Munich, in 1936. And during this time, Hitler actually got rid of many of these policies because he didn't want to look bad to all the countries participating in the Olympics. So this was in 1933. In 1935, something called the Nuremberg Laws come into effect. To come into effect means to become law, to gain power. The Nuremberg Laws established Hitler's theories of racial purity. His theories about race, who was was racially pure, who was racially impure. And this essentially shows that Germans, people with German blood or pure blood, are the best in this racial hierarchy, hierarchia. Germans have Aryan blood. They are considered to be blonde and blue eyes. Jews are considered to be of impure blood. They are at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Most importantly, these Nuremberg laws make it illegal for Germans and Jews to marry and have sexual relations and so on and so forth, which makes it very difficult for couples who were already married, right? This made that illegal, right? So, and this also codified means to make clear who was considered Jewish under German law. It's anyone who had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, which becomes very complicated because that means that people who had converted to other religions could be considered Jewish. People who hadn't been raised Jewish could still be considered Jewish and couldn't be with German partners or German spouses. These laws were made even more popular. They were popularized in groups like the Hitler Youth, kind of like the Nazi German Pioniere. You can see that here. They're young Germans and being lectured to, where you can kind of see in the picture, kind of in the poster on the classroom wall, the categorization of races. And I can recommend to you a good movie that talks about this. I already talked about that. So as you can see at the top of the slides, I'm going in chronological order. So this is kind of happening up until 1938. This is the Nazi assault. Assault is similar to the word attack. In 1938 is the official beginning of the Holocaust. It happens in Rostock, Germany, in an event called Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht means it's usually translated as the night of broken glass, but Kristall means crystal, right? And Nacht means night. Right? And this happens when this is a pogrom. This comes from the Russian word pogrom, when German SS paramilitary forces and others destroy hundreds of Jewish synagogues and businesses in this town. This was in reaction to the assassination of a German figure by a Jewish teenager who was 17, because that individual had taken part in Nazi activities. We don't really have to talk about that. That's not the point. The point is that Kristallnacht was the beginning of the Holocaust. Within 48 hours, so 2 days, 7,500 Jewish businesses were damaged or destroyed. 96 Jews were killed. And here's the kicker. Here's the most important thing. Here's the kicker is an English expression that means here's the most important thing. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Has everyone here heard of concentration camps? You can just turn on your microphone and tell me.
Yeah, we not know about that because in Kazakhstan we had also concentration camps, when we was part of USSR.
Right. So this is an important distinction. So the Gulag, I mean, the labor camps that were part of Kazakhstan are very similar in content to concentration camps during the Holocaust, but the intent is different. Because there are really two kinds of concentration camps. There are concentration camps and annihilation camps. The intent of these camps was to get rid of Jews, which is a little different than the point of the Gulag. We can talk about that at a different point, but yes, very similar to those which were in Kazakhstan. So this is the concentration camp system actually existed since 1933. The first concentration camp was called Dachau. It's in Germany, but it really comes into full force. To come into full force means to become most powerful in 1938. You can see a picture of prisoners here. And they generally wore this striped clothing, and they had to wear kind of they had numbers tattooed on their arms, and yeah, that's kind of what they looked like. At the same time, in all over Nazi occupied territories, Jews were trying to leave. It's a very difficult process to leave a totalitarian regime, as we discussed. I mean, you could talk about this, like Отказники in the Soviet Union, of course. You have to pay for an exit visa. It costs a lot of money. You have to relinquish. To relinquish means to give up a lot of your property to the state. And at the end of the day, you might not even receive an exit visa. But nonetheless, some were granted an exit visa and tried to escape. These efforts were not always successful. Jews were not always welcome in the places that they tried to flee to. The most famous example is the St. Louis, which was actually supposed to go to Cuba. It had 937 passengers. The Cuban government didn't let it dock in Cuba. It wasn't allowed to release its passengers into Cuba. So it went to the nearest country. The nearest country to Cuba is the US, of course. Cuba is very close to Florida. But the US government denied permission. It did not give permission for the passengers to leave the ship. So they were forced to return to Europe, where about 1/4 of them were killed. President Roosevelt absolutely knew about this and didn't do anything. This is a very, very, very dark spot of American history. This could have been stopped. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Nazis are occupying more and more territory, right? This includes Czechoslovakia, this includes Poland, many parts of Central Europe are now under Nazi control. Poland, as I brought up earlier in the very beginning, is incredibly important to mention because it was so heavily Jewish, right? It was 25% Jewish. Some regions were even more than that. Germany was 1% Jewish, which is why policies like the ones that we brought up before, like the Nuremberg Laws and the boycotts, were so important because they were bringing a lot of attention to a very small part of society. But in places like Poland, it's killing very large segments, immobilizing, segregating very large segments of society. We talked about that. Poland is particularly important because it had something called the Warsaw Ghetto. Has anyone here heard of the Warsaw Ghetto? You can say yes or no.
Yes, we know about it.
Okay, so the Warsaw Ghetto is incredibly important. Ghettos were not unique to Warsaw. It's all over Europe, but ghettos were neighborhoods, kind of regions of cities where Jews were allowed to live. They were not really allowed to leave. It was segregation. To segregate means to separate a group of society from the rest of society. So think of it as having a siege, a blockade, blokada of a particular area, right? So they could reduce food supplies, they could reduce medical supplies. And as you can imagine, hundreds of thousands of people were limited. They couldn't get the care they needed. Disease spread very quickly. So here's a picture of Jews in line for food. I already explained this. And then, so in November 1940, German authorities sealed. To seal means to close something, the Warsaw Ghetto, and this severely restricts the supplies for over 300,000 Jews living there. Doesn't sound like a lot. 300,000 is what? The population of not a big city even, but that's a very large percentage of Warsaw's population. Consider this, if a city is 1 million people, right? I think Shymkent is about 1 million people. That's 30% of the whole city is being kept separate from everyone else, is getting less food than everyone else, and having lines like this, where the rest of the city might be just fine. So survival was a daily challenge, right? Okay, and you can hear about stories in places like the Warsaw Ghetto where you were literally seeing dead bodies on the street. I mean, that was the case for much of World War II, not just obviously in the Warsaw Ghetto or in Warsaw more generally, but the Warsaw Ghetto, it was a particularly sharp case. So I'm warning you, there is graphic content ahead. So if you need to step away from your computer, now is an appropriate time to do that. Okay. As you can see, I should have pointed this out on the slides before, they have now changed to something called the final solution. This is now already the real Holocaust. The final solution, as you probably know or may not know, is the name of Hitler's plan to get rid of Jews. Right? So at this point, the concentration camps are in full force, and в полном разгаре. And at this point, about a quarter of all Jews who perish, to perish means to die, in the Holocaust are being shot by killing squads and police battalions following the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Remember that a lot of people who perished in the Holocaust were also from territories that later became part of the Soviet Union. We have a tendency to think of victims of the Holocaust as coming from Poland, just from Poland, from Germany or Austria, but in reality, many of them are also from Belarus, Ukraine, and so on and so forth. These units carried out the mass murder of Jews. Yes, Roma, Romas are Ganya, and communist government officials. Yeah, and as you can see, there are bodies there. These are the SS officials. They were shot usually in right over a ditch. Ditch is a yama, so that they could cover over it with dirt right away and have a mass grave. These mass graves are still being found today. People were usually shipped out to these areas where they could be shot or killed, and shipped even out to concentration camps. In these trains, they're usually called the train cars are, I think, cattle cars, because I think they originally actually meant for animals. So these are commonly used between 1942 and 1944. A good example of this is Anne Frank. Anne Frank, I believe, was shipped in one of these cars. So if you can imagine, the conditions in these train cars were atrocious. Atrocious means horrible, terrible, really bad. So in one car, you could fit 80 to 100 people. That means people were standing, and these journeys could take days. They weren't getting food. Imagine there are no windows. So people are cramming at these spaces to get as much air as they can possibly get. And imagine the sanitary conditions, the hygiene, hygiena, right? Imagine that people have no place to go to the bathroom. They're breathing on each other all the time. These were, a place where people were just getting sick and dying right from the very, very, very beginning. As I said, many people died during the conditions of the journey, and most survivors were killed upon arrival at the killing centers. So some were forced to work, obviously, for long periods of time, but others were killed right immediately, and they could be shot. Another common way of death was in gas chambers. A gas chamber was when people were sent to places that kind of looked like showers. They were often told that they were going to take showers, but from these shower heads, there was gas called Zyklon B, that killed them immediately. So this particular rail car, I've actually seen, it's on display in the United States Holocaust Museum. So these are the crowds that are coming out of these cable cars. Imagine that. Like, imagine being stuck in one space, breathing on someone for that long. So this is from Hungarian occupied Czechoslovakia, which is actually current day Ukraine. And they are brought to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz-Birkenau, commonly known as Auschwitz. It was the largest concentration camp. I recently read that 1 million people were killed there. It's a tremendous amount of people, 1 million. There were 6 million Jews killed, about 6 million others killed. So that's about 1/12 of the total victims of the Holocaust were killed at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz is also probably the most popular concentration camp to visit today. It has a big visitor center, and it's very famous for its gate that says Arbeit macht frei on the top of it. Does anyone know any German? No one. So Arbeit macht frei means work makes you free, which is funny because work in Auschwitz very much did not make you free. That particular sign was vandalized and stolen. The one in Auschwitz is not real anymore. And I believe the United States Holocaust Museum has a copy of it. Yes, as I said, so the overwhelming majority of Jews who entered the Nazi killing centers were murdered in gas chambers. I just brought these up before. That's the gas, usually within hours of arrival, and their bodies were cremated. Most sickeningly, often it was other Jews who were forced to cremate the bodies of the Jews who were killed. You can read about this in a very famous book called Night by Elie Wiesel, who is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He won the Nobel Peace Prize precisely for his work on telling people about the Holocaust. This is probably my favorite picture because when people were brought to concentration camps, most of their belongings were confiscated. Or sold. So that meant clothing, jewelry, of course, teeth, but also things like shoes. Their hair was collected, right? Because they could be made into wigs. It's really disgusting. You could read lots of stories about this, what they did to Jewish bodies. But you can see these shoes on display. These are the shoes collected of concentration camp victims. And what's the most painful for me is you can see children's shoes, right? It's not just adults. And you have to remember that the Holocaust affected, Jews of all ages, people of all ages, but especially Jews of all ages. So this is from a particular camp in Poland called Majdanek. I should mention that there were dozens of concentration camps, but there are some that were more famous than others. The most famous are probably Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Majdanek, Theresienstadt, and there are others. This is a photo of a death march. These are people are forced to walk from one concentration camp to another. This is a great way to figure out who's weak and to kill people. I mean, I hate to be crude, but that's really the point. The point was to see who was weak and to shoot them on the way. This was kind of toward the end of the war when German authorities knew that their time was close to being finished. What's remarkable actually about this photo, I don't know the history of this photo, is that it was taken and it looks like it was secret. And there are cases of Jewish prisoners getting hold of cameras and taking photos of what was going on. There are very few photos like this, but I do know of situations like this, and I would be happy to answer any questions about that if you have any. Okay, so another warning, there is graphic content ahead. If you need to step away from your computer, take a few seconds to do that. Okay. So these are some horrific photos. These are US Army officers visiting the camps after liberation, primarily by the Soviet Army. I should say that the first person to report on the condition of the concentration camps was actually a Soviet reporter, Vasily Grossman. You should know that. But the first people to really take photos of the camps were Americans in 1945 for the American magazine Life. And I don't know if this particular photo comes from it, but many very famous photos do. And when they were brought to the American public in the magazine, they didn't believe the photos because they were so horrific. No one could believe that this was going on because they had heard about what was going on in Europe, but it was so far removed that they didn't believe it. Unfortunately, Holocaust denial still exists. Many people don't believe the photos. They believe that it's all made up, but I can really tell you that this is true. Eisenhower himself visited the camp. Eisenhower was the general of the US Army at the time and became president in the late 40s, early 50s. So he was very well aware of this. He publicly expressed his shock and revulsion. Revulsion means disgust at something. And he really wanted people to see the camps firsthand, which is part of the reason why these photos were brought to the American public in magazines. Can you imagine today photos like this one being published in magazines? No, probably not, because they are so horrific. The Holocaust doesn't end with any particular thing, but as a beginning in, I think, 1945, maybe 1946, there's something called the Nuremberg Trials, which is when the main perpetrators, the organizers of the Holocaust, were brought to court for their crimes against humanity. Some of them, most of them were executed. One of them committed suicide. There's also the case of Adolf Eichmann, who was escaped to Argentina. He was also one of the organizers of the final solution of the Holocaust. He was brought to Israel and he was found guilty. And he is the only person, I believe, in Israel's history, to have been killed legally by law as punishment. So 22 major war criminals were tried for war crimes, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and conspiracies to commit such crimes. This is when the term genocide becomes legal and when it becomes considered a crime against humanity. So after the Holocaust, the United Nations and other international organizations work to prevent genocides. Unfortunately, genocides don't end with the Holocaust. So as I said, yeah, 1948. Genocide has continued. It has happened in Sudan, in Rwanda, Bosnia. I went to Bosnia in 2018, and wrote extensively on genocide there. And there are other signs of Holocaust and of genocide in other parts of the world. So just because it happened, it began in 1938 and ended really with the trials in 1945, that doesn't mean it can't happen again. And it is critically important that we preserve the memory of this event forever and remember the 6 million Jews who perished and the 6 million others who perished at the hands of Nazi Germany. That's the end of my presentation.
So, yeah, if there are no questions, I think we can wrap up the meeting. Leora, I'm really thankful to you for bringing our nations closer, for making the bridge to understanding of that historical issues that unfortunately took place about 1 century ago. Thank you again. And thank you for the participants for joining us.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you all for helping to preserve the memory of the 12 million people who perished in the Holocaust. It sounds like a big number, but with events like these, we can really help to preserve their memory, which is important to me personally, as my family was a victim of the Holocaust. If you have any questions, you can write to me on Instagram. I don't check it very much, but I wrote my Instagram handle and the name there. And I hope to see you at other American Corner Pavlodar events soon.
Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye. Stay tuned and be healthy.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.